Jake had always dreamed of visiting London. The busy streets, the grand buildings, and of course, the famous landmarks like the Big Ben and Tower Bridge. After months of saving up for this trip, he and his friends finally arrived in the city. They could hardly contain their excitement as they stepped off the plane. London felt like a world of possibilities, and Jake was determined to make the most of it. The first day was filled with sightseeing. They took pictures in front of Buckingham Palace and tried to snap selfies with the red phone booths. But Jake's favorite part of the trip, so far, was watching the royal guards. He had heard so much about them, how they stood perfectly still, and how nothing seemed to distract them. He couldn't wait to see them in action. The guards on horseback were a sight to behold. They wore their iconic red jackets, tall black hats, and shiny boots. The horses were equally impressive, standing tall and calm. They didn't even seem to mind the crowds of tourists standing nearby, snapping photos. Jake and his friends arrived at Horse Guards Parade, one of the most famous locations to watch the guards. It was late in the afternoon, and the sun was just starting to set. The golden light made the scene even more beautiful. Jake's heart raced. This was one of the things he had been looking forward to the most. As they stood there, Jake couldn't help but notice how serious and disciplined the guards were. Their faces were stern, their posture perfect, and they never moved a muscle. It was like they were statues, but alive and powerful. Jake laughed to himself, thinking about how strict the guards were, but he didn't really understand just how much discipline they had to follow. His friends began to joke around, pointing out how funny it was that the guards never showed any emotion, no matter how much people stared at them. "They must be robots," one of his friends said, and they all chuckled. Jake, being the adventurous one, decided it was time to get a closer look. He was always the one who took risks, pushing the limits just to see what would happen. It wasn't that he had any bad intentions, he just liked the thrill of stepping outside the usual boundaries. "Let's get closer," Jake whispered to his friends, a mischievous smile on his face. His friends hesitated for a moment, unsure, but Jake was already moving ahead. They followed him, laughing nervously, unsure of what was about to happen. The guard was standing still, his eyes scanning the surroundings. Jake couldn't resist. He took a few more steps forward, just close enough to see the horse's muscles twitch with every movement. It was almost like he was in a different world, standing inches away from something that had been a part of history for centuries. But little did he know, getting closer to the guards and their horses was a mistake that would lead to a lesson he would never forget. The next morning, Jake and his friends woke up early, ready to explore more of London. Today, they had planned to visit Horse Guards Parade again to watch the changing of the guards. This time, they wanted to get a closer view of the royal guards on horseback. They had heard that the parade was one of the most famous ceremonies in the city, and they were excited to experience it for themselves. As they made their way to Horse Guards Parade, Jake couldn't help but feel a rush of excitement. The streets were already bustling with tourists from all over the world. The weather was perfect for a parade. The sun was shining brightly, and there was a cool breeze in the air. The historic buildings around them made the moment feel even more special. Jake had seen many pictures of the guards, but seeing them in person was a different experience entirely. As they arrived at the parade grounds, Jake noticed a crowd of people standing along the fence, waiting for the ceremony to begin. He could hear chatter and laughter as tourists eagerly chatted about the history behind the royal guards. Everyone seemed to be in high spirits, taking pictures and enjoying the atmosphere. Jake and his friends found a good spot near the front, giving them the best view of the guards and their magnificent horses. Soon, the royal guards began to assemble. Jake could hardly believe his eyes. The guards were dressed in their iconic red uniforms and tall black hats, their faces as serious as ever. Each one was mounted on a stunning horse, their coats gleaming in the sunlight. The horses stood tall, looking as proud and majestic as the guards themselves. The parade was about to begin, and everything felt so grand and official. Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as he watched them line up. It was like they had stepped out of a history book. The ceremony was something that had been done for hundreds of years, and Jake felt lucky to be part of it. He turned to his friends with a big smile on his face. "This is amazing," he whispered. As the ceremony started, the guards began to march in perfect unison. The sound of their boots hitting the ground echoed across the parade ground. It was clear that these men and women were trained to perform at the highest level of precision. The horses, too, moved with remarkable coordination, their hooves striking the ground with a soft, steady rhythm. Jake couldn't take his eyes off the guards. He admired their discipline and the sense of power they exuded. Every movement was calculated, and there was no room for error. He could see that the guards were serious about their duties, and he understood that their role was far more than just ceremonial. They were there to protect the royal family and to represent the history of the British monarchy. Jake's thoughts were interrupted when one of the guards turned to face the crowd. The horse he was riding stood perfectly still, not even flinching as the crowd snapped pictures. It was as if the guard and the horse had become one, a symbol of strength and tradition. Jake couldn't help but think that this was something most people would never experience back home. London had such a rich history, and today he was lucky enough to witness a piece of it. However, as the ceremony continued, Jake's attention started to wander, and he began to think about how much closer he could get to the guards. He noticed that there was a small gap between the horses, and the idea of stepping a little closer crossed his mind. He looked at his friends, who were also enjoying the show, but didn't seem as interested in getting closer. But Jake was always looking for the next adventure, and today seemed like the perfect day to test his luck. As the parade continued, Jake couldn't stop thinking about how close he could get to the royal guards. The horses were magnificent, and the guards looked like statues of strength and power. They were so still, so serious, and the whole scene felt almost unreal. For a moment, Jake wondered if the guards could really stay that still for the entire ceremony. The crowd around him was buzzing with excitement, but Jake felt like he was missing out on something more. His friends, meanwhile, were content just to watch the ceremony from a safe distance, snapping pictures and chatting. But Jake wasn't the type to stand by and watch. He was always looking for an opportunity to do something daring, something memorable. "Hey, guys," Jake whispered, glancing around. "What do you think about getting a bit closer to the horses? We could get some really cool shots." His friends looked hesitant, clearly unsure about getting too close to the guards. One of them even pointed out the warning signs around the parade ground. "Do not touch the guards or the horses." But Jake wasn't worried. He didn't think anything bad could happen. It wasn't like he was going to do anything drastic, right? He just wanted to get a better view, and maybe even take a cooler photo. The guards had to understand that tourists were excited to be there, right? "I'm just going to step a little closer," Jake said with a grin. He wasn't looking for trouble. He just wanted a closer look, a more personal experience of the parade. His friends shrugged but stayed back, still a little nervous. They didn't want to get involved in anything that might attract the attention of the guards. Jake, however, moved forward. He carefully edged his way around the crowd, keeping his eyes fixed on the guards and their horses. He was close now, really close. He could see the shiny leather of the horses' saddles and the precision in the guards' uniforms. The horses were magnificent, their muscles rippling beneath the polished saddles. It was like nothing he had ever seen before. He raised his phone to capture a better shot, feeling proud of himself for getting so close. As Jake inched forward, he couldn't help but feel like he was testing the limits. He thought to himself, "The guards have probably seen hundreds of tourists up close. This is nothing new." But there was a tiny voice in the back of his mind, a little whisper telling him that maybe he was crossing a line. But Jake didn't listen to that voice. He was already too caught up in the excitement of the moment. He reached out his hand, brushing it against the horse's bridle. The horse shifted slightly, its ears flicking back. Jake smiled to himself, thinking it was no big deal. He thought the horse was just reacting to his touch, nothing more. The guard, however, noticed immediately. The man on the horse shifted his gaze toward Jake, his eyes hardening. There was a moment of complete silence. Jake felt his heart race as he realized that he might have done something wrong. But instead of feeling regret, he felt a thrill. He was so close, and it had all felt so safe. Jake's friends watched from the side, sensing that something wasn't quite right. They exchanged looks, unsure of what Jake had done. But it was too late to stop now. Jake was committed to the moment, completely unaware of how much trouble he was about to face. Jake felt a rush of excitement as his fingers brushed against the horse's bridle. For a split second, he thought he had achieved something special, something few tourists ever got to do. But before he could even take another step, he felt the eyes of the royal guard upon him. The guard's gaze was stern, his face unchanging, like a statue. The moment felt like it lasted forever, and Jake froze in place, realizing that maybe, just maybe, he had overstepped a boundary. The crowd around him seemed to grow quieter, as if everyone was suddenly aware of the tension in the air. The guard on the horse remained still, but his posture was no longer relaxed. Jake could sense that something was about to happen. The silence was broken when the guard, his voice clear and commanding, spoke. "Step back, sir." It wasn't a request, it was an order. The tone was firm, and the words carried authority. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He quickly looked around at his friends, who were now staring wide-eyed at him from behind the crowd, silently urging him to step back. Jake swallowed nervously, the weight of the guard's warning sinking in. He hadn't expected this kind of response. The royal guard had always been seen as serious. But in that moment, Jake understood just how serious they were. They weren't there for show. They had a duty to protect, and that duty was not something to be taken lightly. This wasn't a movie or a game. Feeling embarrassed, Jake quickly took a step back, but it wasn't enough to put him out of the guard's line of sight. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do next. His friends, who had been laughing and enjoying the show just moments ago, now looked more worried than amused. One of them whispered, "Maybe you should just leave it alone." Jake ignored them, still trying to play it cool, though his palms were starting to sweat. The guard's eyes never left Jake. His face remained stoic, unwavering, and his horse stood perfectly still. Jake could feel the weight of the moment. It was as if time had slowed down, and every small movement felt magnified. Was this really happening? He had just wanted to see the guards up close, but now he was feeling the full force of their professionalism and control. Jake could sense the tension in the air. He had crossed a line, and the consequences were becoming very clear. The royal guard wasn't here to entertain tourists. They had a job to do, and they were doing it with precision and care. Jake realized that he had underestimated their role and how important it was to respect the boundaries they set. As he stepped back further, the guard on the horse didn't move an inch. The sense of power and discipline that radiated from him made Jake feel small, like a child caught in the act. He felt a rush of guilt. He hadn't intended to cause any trouble. It had just been a spontaneous decision to get a better view. But now he understood that the guards weren't there for personal amusement. Jake glanced at his friends again. They were clearly relieved that he was stepping back, but they didn't say much. The moment had lost its excitement. In fact, it had turned into a wake-up call. Jake knew that he had learned something valuable, though it was a lesson he would have preferred not to learn the hard way. As the royal guard stood tall on his horse, completely unbothered by Jake's actions, the reality of the situation sank in. This wasn't just a parade. It was a reminder that some things in life demanded respect. Jake felt his heart racing as the royal guard's warning echoed in his ears. He had taken a few steps back, but his pride still stung. He hadn't meant to make a scene, but there he was, standing in front of a crowd, with all eyes on him. The guard's glare had left him feeling embarrassed and small, but Jake wasn't used to backing down. He wanted to brush it off as a simple mistake, but deep down, He knew it was more than that. For a moment, Jake stood there frozen, his mind buzzing. He felt stupid, like a kid who had just been scolded by a teacher. The excitement he had felt just moments ago was gone, replaced by the weight of his actions. He had thought it would be fun to get closer to the guards, to test the limits. But now he understood that some lines shouldn't be crossed. His friends were starting to look at him differently, and Jake could feel the judgment in their glances. The crowd around him continued to watch the parade, but it felt like they were all aware of what had just happened. Jake could feel the eyes of the tourists on him, and it made him even more uncomfortable. He could hear whispers from the crowd, some of them clearly commenting on his foolish move. Jake's face flushed with embarrassment as he realized that his harmless joke had turned into a public spectacle. The horse's ears twitched, and for a second, Jake thought the animal might react. He held his breath, but the horse remained calm. The guard, however, wasn't as patient. Without a word, the guard nudged his horse and slowly began to move forward, leaving Jake standing in the middle of the crowd. It felt like a silent dismissal, and Jake couldn't help but feel foolish for having provoked it in the first place. Still standing in the same spot, Jake could hear the soft clop of the horse's hooves and the crisp sound of the guard's boots as they moved forward. The show continued, but the excitement that had filled Jake just moments ago seemed far away now. He tried to shake off the feeling, but he couldn't escape the sinking realization that he had been wrong. His actions had disrupted something serious, something he didn't fully understand until now. Jake slowly turned to his friends, but none of them said anything. They weren't angry, but they were clearly uncomfortable with what had just happened. One of them shrugged and said, "You shouldn't mess with them, Jake. They're not here to play." Jake knew his friend was right, and it made him feel even worse. He had thought it would be funny, but now it just felt disrespectful. As the parade carried on, Jake stood there, still caught in the consequences of his actions. He hadn't meant to cause trouble, but he had. The reality of the situation hit him. He had crossed a line, and now it was too late to take it back. He wasn't sure what he had expected. Maybe the guard would just laugh it off, or maybe the horse would simply move aside. But instead, he had been met with a firm reminder that some things were off-limits, and messing with the royal guards wasn't one of them. Jake finally looked away, his pride stinging. But this time, he knew he had learned an important lesson. Respect was something that couldn't be taken lightly. Jake stood there, feeling like the center of attention in a way he never wanted to be. The parade had moved on, and the royal guards continued their duties as if nothing had happened. But for Jake, the moment was far from over. He felt the weight of the crowd's gaze on him, and it wasn't just from his friends anymore. Tourists were whispering, pointing, and exchanging looks. Everyone seemed to know that something had gone wrong. His friends, who had been laughing earlier, now looked uneasy. They had seen Jake take a risk, but they hadn't expected it to blow up like this. The quiet murmurs from the crowd only made the situation worse. Jake could feel his face turning red with embarrassment. It wasn't just that he had made a fool of himself. It was that he had made a scene in front of so many people. He could hardly look anyone in the eye. The guard and his horse were moving away from him now, and Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of shame. The cool, calm professionalism of the guard was something Jake had taken for granted. He had thought they were just statues, standing there for tourists to admire. But now he saw them for what they really were, trained soldiers, performing an important job with discipline and respect. Jake finally turned to his friends, hoping for some support. But instead of the laughter and light-hearted jokes he was used to, all he saw were nervous glances. They had stopped taking pictures and were now staring at the ground, clearly uncomfortable. One of them finally spoke, though his tone was gentle. "Maybe you shouldn't have pushed it, man. They're serious about their job." Jake nodded, feeling guilty. He had crossed a line, and now he was left with the aftermath. The most painful part was the realization that he hadn't just embarrassed himself. He had embarrassed his friends too. He wished he could go back and undo what he had done, but there was no way to change it now. The damage had been done. As Jake stood there, he noticed that more people were starting to notice him. Some were shaking their heads, others were whispering behind their hands. The video had already begun to spread. Someone in the crowd had filmed the entire scene, and now people were making comments about the foolish tourist who thought he could mess with the royal guard. Jake didn't have to look at his phone to know that it was already blowing up on social media. The video was viral. He was sure of it. He had made a name for himself, but it wasn't the kind of fame anyone would want. It didn't take long for the police officer standing nearby to approach. The officer wasn't rude, but his tone was firm and official. "Sir, you need to understand that this is not a place for jokes," he said. "The Royal Guard's role is serious. You can't just touch the horses or make a scene." Jake felt his stomach drop. He had always heard about how seriously the guards were taken, but he never thought it would apply to him. He had never imagined he would be in trouble over something like this. The officer wasn't threatening him, but the seriousness of his words made it clear that Jake had crossed a line, and there were consequences for his actions. As the officer spoke, Jake's heart sank lower and lower. He wished he could just disappear. The excitement he had felt when they first arrived in London seemed like a distant memory now. Instead of having an amazing experience, he was now faced with the reality of his poor choices. He had underestimated the seriousness of the situation, and now it was too late to turn back. Jake stood there, feeling the weight of the moment like a heavy burden. The police officer had walked away, but the feeling of discomfort hadn't left him. Instead of enjoying his time in London, he had now become the subject of whispers and sideways glances. He had only wanted a closer look at the royal guards, but now he was caught in the consequences of his actions. His friends were no longer laughing. They were quiet, clearly unsure of how to react. Jake could sense the tension in the air. The excitement he had felt earlier was long gone. Now the parade felt like a distant memory, overshadowed by his foolish mistake. Jake felt embarrassed and small. He had always been the one to push limits, to try things others wouldn't. But for the first time, he realized that some lines were never meant to be crossed. He had treated the royal guards as if they were just part of the scenery, a backdrop for photos and fun moments. But in reality, they were far more than that. They were symbols of tradition, respect, and duty. The realization hit Jake hard. He hadn't taken the time to understand the importance of what he was witnessing. The guards weren't just standing still for tourists to admire. They were performing a centuries-old tradition, one that held great significance. Jake had thought he could get closer for a better picture, but he had completely overlooked the respect they deserved. His mind wandered back to the moment when he had reached out and touched the horse's bridle. He hadn't meant any harm. It was just a spontaneous decision. But now, standing there in the aftermath, Jake could see how wrong he had been. The royal guard had given him a direct warning, and the consequences of ignoring that warning were now clear. He had disturbed the order, and it was something he couldn't undo. As the parade continued in the background, Jake's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp realization. The situation was bigger than just him. He had made a mistake, yes, but it wasn't just about embarrassing himself. He had disrespected something that held deep meaning for many people. The royal guards weren't just soldiers. They represented something much larger: the British monarchy, the history of the United Kingdom, and the values of discipline and honor. Jake began to feel a sense of regret. His playful actions had seemed harmless at first, but now he understood the weight of his choices. He wasn't just a tourist anymore. He had become someone who had tested the boundaries and gotten a serious wake-up call. He looked at his friends, who were still standing a few steps away. They didn't say much, but their eyes told him everything he needed to know. They had always known Jake was a risk-taker, but now they saw the consequences of that behavior. Jake wasn't sure what to say to them. He felt like he had let them down too. The crowd had started to thin out, and Jake knew it was time to move on. He wasn't sure how to salvage the rest of the day, But he knew one thing for sure. He had learned a lesson that would stay with him for a long time. He had always believed that pushing limits was exciting, but now he understood that there were moments in life when respect and caution mattered far more. Jake silently followed his friends, knowing that he couldn't change what had happened, but he could change how he viewed situations moving forward. And most importantly, he had learned to never take something like the Royal Guard's duty lightly again. Jake walked along the streets of London, trying to shake off the embarrassment of what had happened. The parade was over, and the Royal Guards had returned to their posts, but Jake's mind was still racing. He couldn't stop thinking about the guards' stern warning, the whispers from the crowd, and the feeling of everyone staring at him. But little did he know, the most uncomfortable part of his day was yet to come. As they walked, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Jake pulled it out, expecting a simple notification, maybe a message from his family or a friend back home. But when he checked the screen, his eyes widened in surprise. There were dozens of notifications, texts, social media updates, and even comments from people he didn't know. His heart skipped a beat. Was something wrong? Jake tapped on a notification and found a video. His face appeared on the screen, looking completely out of place and foolish, standing near the Royal Guard's horse. He could hear his own voice in the background, laughing and talking to his friends, while the guard's warning was loud and clear in the video. The footage clearly showed Jake reaching out to touch the horse and the guard's reaction. Everything that had happened moments earlier was captured on film. The video was already going viral. Jake couldn't believe it. People were commenting on the video, sharing it with their friends, and tagging others. He felt the blood drain from his face as he scrolled through the posts. Some people were laughing at his mistake, while others were shaking their heads in disbelief. It seemed like everyone had seen it. This guy thinks the guards are a joke. The Royal Guard isn't a tourist attraction, buddy. When will tourists learn? Respect the rules. Jake read the comments, and each one felt like another wave crashing over him. He had become the laughingstock of the day, and the realization hit him hard. What he had thought was a harmless joke had turned into a public embarrassment. And now, there was no escape from it. His actions had been captured and shared, and the whole world was watching. His friends, who had been walking beside him, stopped when they saw Jake's face. "What's wrong?" one of them asked. Jake showed them the video, his hand shaking slightly. They all stared at the screen in silence for a moment, and then one of his friends sighed. "Well, there's no going back now." Jake's stomach turned. It was one thing to feel embarrassed in front of a few people, but to know that thousands, maybe millions, of people were watching him make the same mistake. It felt unbearable. He closed his eyes for a moment, wishing he could somehow erase the video, but he knew it was out there. The damage was done. The video continued to spread, and Jake realized that this moment, this mistake, would be something he'd never escape. The next time he visited London, people might still remember the foolish tourist who tried to mess with the Royal Guards. But there was something else Jake realized. While he couldn't undo the past, he could learn from it. The lesson was clear: respect, humility, and understanding were far more important than getting a good photo or a laugh. He had learned this the hard way, but it was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Jake turned off his phone and tucked it into his pocket. His friends were still standing nearby, watching him. "Let's just go grab a coffee," one of them suggested. Jake nodded, silently agreeing. The video might be out there, but at least he could take this opportunity to make things right with himself. It wasn't the trip he had imagined, but maybe it could still be a trip that taught him something important. Jake's day had taken an unexpected turn, and as he sat in the small cafe, sipping on his coffee, he couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The video of his mistake was still circulating online, and he was sure it would follow him for a while. But after everything that had unfolded, he realized something important. This wasn't the end of his trip. It was the start of a lesson he would never forget. As he sat with his friends, he couldn't help but reflect on how everything had gone wrong so quickly. All he had wanted was to get a closer look at the royal guards, to experience something unique. But in his excitement, he had failed to consider the importance of respecting the rules and the people who followed them. He had treated something serious as a joke, and that mistake had led to a chain of events he hadn't expected. Jake's phone buzzed again. It was another notification. More comments on the video. He had already read hundreds of comments from people who were either laughing at him or criticizing his behavior. Some of them were kind, saying things like, "We've all made mistakes," or "At least you learned." But others weren't so forgiving. Jake sighed. He understood why people were upset. He had disrespected the royal guards, and he had to own that. "I need to do something," Jake said quietly to his friends. They all looked at him, waiting for him to explain. "I need to apologize," he continued. "I don't want anyone to think I did this on purpose or that I don't care about the guards. I didn't think about what I was doing." He paused, feeling the weight of his words. "It's not just about the guards either. I disrespected the whole tradition, and that wasn't right." One of his friends nodded. "It takes a lot to admit when you're wrong. I think that's the first step." Jake smiled weakly. It felt good to get that off his chest, but he knew he had more to do. He grabbed his phone and typed up an apology. It wasn't easy, but he wanted to make sure people understood that he wasn't trying to cause trouble. He had been reckless, yes, but he had learned something from it. He quickly hit send. His apology read, "I want to sincerely apologize to the royal guards and anyone I may have offended by my actions. What I did was disrespectful, and I now understand the importance of the role they play in preserving tradition and history. It was a thoughtless mistake, and I will make sure to be more respectful in the future." He hesitated for a moment before posting it online. Jake knew that apologizing wouldn't erase the video or the mistake, but he hoped it would show people that he had learned from his actions. As Jake looked up, he saw his friends nodding in approval. It wasn't the perfect solution, but it was a start. He had learned the hard way that some things in life were too important to take lightly, and now he would carry that lesson with him wherever he went. His phone buzzed again, but this time, the comments were different. People were starting to thank him for his honesty and maturity in owning up to his mistake. While some still found the video funny, others appreciated his apology. Slowly but surely, Jake was beginning to feel like he could move past this, even if it took time. Jake leaned back in his chair and smiled. It hadn't been the trip he had expected, but it had been a trip that taught him a lesson he wouldn't forget. And for that, he was grateful.